weapons were used during World War II. Soldiers became engineers, designers, and craftsmen, turning the most ordinary objects into deadly devices. Now we will learn what soldiers did in the trenches with the tools at hand and how effective they were. This is a story about how ingenuity became as important a weapon as a rifle or a grenade. Watch the video to the end and you'll learn how an ordinary glass ball covered with glue was supposed to stop tanks. What medieval weapon was used in the middle of the last century? World War I brought a seemingly long-forgotten weapon back to the battlefield, the trench club. World War II, with its protracted fighting in trenches and urban ruins, only refined this simple and brutal idea. When a rifle with a bayonet became cumbersome and inconvenient in the confined space of a trench or dark basement, soldiers turned to a centuries-old remedy. These clubs were rarely produced centrally. They were the fruit of soldiers' creativity. Anything that came to hand was used. Any sturdy piece of wood could serve as a base, a broken table leg, part of a fence, or simply a thick branch found in the forest. The main task was to make the striking part heavier and stronger. Soldiers hammered large nails, bolts, or pieces of rebar into the top. Sometimes they attached a heavy gear from broken equipment to the end of the club, or simply wrapped it with barbed wire. Each club was unique and reflected both the materials available and the personal preferences of its creator. Some were rough and asymmetrical, made hastily before battle. Others were true works of trench art, with carefully carved handles and thoughtful balance. The handle was often wrapped in cloth or leather for a more secure grip. This was important because in the heat of battle, the weapon had to be able to withstand slipping out of sweaty or wet hands. Soldiers understood that their lives could depend on this small detail. The simplicity of its design made this weapon incredibly reliable. Unlike complex firearms, a club could not jam or fail at the most inopportune moment. It was intuitive to use and did not require special training. The psychological effect of such a weapon was also enormous. The sight of an enemy armed with a spiked club was depressing. It was a return to primitive cruelty, a reminder that in close combat, the rules of civilization ceased to apply. Such clubs were used by soldiers of all armies. They were found in the equipment of Soviet assault groups, British commandos, and American Marines. The need for simple and effective weapons for close combat was universal. These items are a vivid testament to what war becomes up close. When technology retreats, the most basic instincts and the simplest tools come into play. The trench club became a grim symbol of 20th century trench warfare. We would be very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about this return to medieval methods in 20th century warfare? Write about it in the comments. Ready to learn the whole truth about a weapon you are surely familiar with? Perhaps the most famous improvised weapon of World War II is the Molotov cocktail. Its name has become synonymous with guerrilla warfare, and its simplicity and effectiveness have made it the weapon of choice for partisans, militias, and soldiers around the world. But few people know the history of its creation and the intricacies of its design. This weapon got its famous name during the Soviet-Finnish War of 1939 to 1940. Finnish soldiers named it in mockery of the USSR's People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, Vyacheslav Molotov. This was their response to Soviet propaganda, which claimed that bombers were dropping humanitarian aid rather than bombs. The basis of the cocktail was extremely simple. A glass bottle filled with a flammable mixture. Gasoline, kerosene, or alcohol were used as fuel. However, simply using a flammable liquid was not as effective as desired. The real secret to the effectiveness of the Molotov cocktail was the thickener. Fuel oil, tar, rosin, or even soap shavings were added to the mixture. This made the liquid viscous, allowing it to stick to the tank's armor and burn longer and hotter. The principle of operation was simple. The bottle was smashed against the tank's hull. The flammable mixture spread and ignited from the wick. The burning viscous liquid flowed into the engine's ventilation grills, causing a fire and putting the vehicle out of action. The wick was also an important element. It was usually a simple rag soaked in fuel and inserted into the neck of the bottle. Before throwing, the wick was lit, which required exceptional composure from the fighter. Using a cocktail was extremely dangerous for the thrower. He had to get close enough to the tank to throw it, risking being caught in machine gun fire. It was a weapon of last resort when there were no other anti-tank weapons left. Over time, the design was improved. Chemical igniters appeared, ampules with sulfuric acid and bertillate salt, which were attached to the bottle. Upon impact, the ampules broke, the chemicals mixed and ignited the combustible mixture, eliminating the need to light the wick manually. Molotov cocktails were used extensively on all fronts. They were made in factories and field workshops and used by both regular armies and partisan units. Their simplicity of manufacture allowed them to be produced in huge quantities. This weapon became a symbol of popular resistance. It showed that complex guns were not always necessary to fight armored vehicles. Sometimes a bottle, fuel, and courage were enough. But what if I told you that British engineers went even further and created a grenade that was designed to literally stick to a tank? Are you ready to learn the truth about the strangest anti-tank weapon of World War II? Guess how long it took to create the following weapon? In 1940, Britain found itself in a desperate situation. Anticipating an imminent German invasion, the country was in dire need of simple and inexpensive anti-tank weapons for its militia. It was then that one of the most unusual inventions of the war came into being: the number 74 grenade, better known as the sticky bomb. The idea belonged to Major Millis Jeffries, head of one of the secret design bureaus. He proposed creating a grenade that would not bounce off the sloped armor of a tank, but would stick to it, ensuring maximum effect from the explosion. The concept was simple, but its implementation turned out to be a real nightmare. The main component of the sticky bomb was a glass sphere filled with nitroglycerin. Glass was chosen so that the explosion would not produce large fragments that could be dangerous to the thrower. The entire structure was housed in a thin metal casing. The most important and problematic part was the adhesive. The grenade casing was coated with a powerful adhesive that was supposed to hold it securely on a vertical surface. The adhesive was so strong that the grenade would stick to anything, including a soldier's uniform. To protect against accidental sticking, the grenade was placed in a special tin casing consisting of two halves. Before throwing, the soldier had to pull out the pin, which released the handle, and then throw off the protective casing. After that, he had only a few seconds to attach the grenade to the target. During testing, the sticky bomb proved to be an extremely capricious device. It adhered perfectly to clean and dry metal surfaces. However, it refused to stick to armor covered with dirt, dust, or moisture, which was the norm in combat conditions. Despite its obvious shortcomings and dangerous handling, Prime Minister Winston Churchill insisted on mass production. He believed that in a total war, even such an imperfect weapon was better than nothing. About 2.5 million of these grenades were produced. Training soldiers to use this device was a separate task. Instructors advised not to throw the grenade, but to run up to the tank and attach it by hand, which was practically suicide. Nevertheless, there were cases of its successful use, including in North Africa and during the Normandy landings. The sticky bomb did not become a miracle weapon capable of stopping tank armadas. However, it is a striking example of engineering thought taken to the point of absurdity in a desperate attempt to find a solution to an impossible task. It is a symbol of British determination to fight to the end by any means available. The history of this weapon shows how, in wartime, the line between ingenious invention and dangerous absurdity becomes very thin. It has gone down in history as one of the most curious, yet at the same time courageous, decisions. Did you know that during World War II, explosives were made using socks? If the sticky bomb was an example of a complex and unreliable solution, then the numbered 82 grenade, or Gammon's grenade, was its complete opposite. It was a brilliantly simple, flexible, and effective weapon, created by a soldier for soldiers. Its history shows how common sense and field experience can surpass complex engineering calculations. The grenade was invented by Lieutenant Richard Gammons of the British Parachute Regiment. He was disappointed with standard grenades, which had a fixed power and were ineffective against a variety of targets. He needed a weapon whose charge could be adjusted depending on the task at hand. Gammon's grenade design was extremely simple. It consisted of a cloth bag, similar to a sock, with a metal neck. A standard number 69 grenade fuse was attached to the neck. The main advantage was that the soldier himself decided how much explosive to put in the bag. A small amount of plastic explosive was enough to destroy infantry or a machine gun nest. To blow up equipment or a small fortification, the bag could be filled to capacity. This flexibility made the Gammons grenade a versatile tool. It replaced both anti-personnel grenades and powerful demolition charges. For paratroopers, for whom the weight of their equipment was critical, this allowed them to carry fewer different types of ammunition. Plastic explosives were usually used as the explosive. They could be easily molded and divided into pieces of the required size. Soldiers carried the explosives separately and the bags and fuses separately, assembling the grenade immediately before use. Another advantage was the shape of the grenade. The soft cloth bag did not roll off sloping surfaces, as grenades with a round body did. This was especially useful when attacking armored vehicles. Gammons' grenade proved so successful that it became popular with British and Canadian special forces. It was lightweight, powerful, and allowed for creativity in combat missions. Soldiers appreciated it for its simplicity and reliability. This weapon is a striking example of how a simple idea born in the field can be more effective than complex factory designs. It did not require rare materials or sophisticated technology and could be mass-produced cheaply. Gammons' grenade proved that sometimes the best weapon is not the most complex one, but the one that gives the soldier more freedom and control. It was a real construction set for a demolition expert, allowing him to assemble exactly the charge he needed here and now. Want to know how soldiers created even more powerful explosive devices right on the battlefield using materials at hand? The flamethrower was one of the most terrifying weapons on the battlefield. The psychological effect of a wall of fire burning everything in its path was enormous. However, factory-made flamethrowers were heavy, cumbersome, and not always available, especially for guerrilla units. The need for such weapons forced soldiers and partisans to create their own homemade versions of flamethrowers. These devices were extremely dangerous, not only for the enemy, but also for the flamethrower operator. However, in urban combat or when storming fortifications, their effectiveness justified the risk. The basis for a homemade flamethrower was usually a cylinder or tank for a combustible mixture. It could be a regular fire extinguisher, a tank from an agricultural sprayer, or even a sturdy backpack with a rubber chamber inside. The main requirement was that it be airtight and able to withstand pressure. The same compounds were used as fuel mixtures as for Molotov cocktails, but in larger volumes. Gasoline was mixed with fuel oil or tar to create a viscous, slow-burning, and highly adhesive liquid. Sometimes phosphorus was added, which ignited on contact with air. The most difficult part was creating a system for ejecting the mixture. This required a source of compressed gas. Most often, a cylinder of carbon dioxide or nitrogen was used, which was connected to the tank via a valve. When the trigger was pressed, the valve opened, and the compressed gas pushed the combustible mixture through the hose and nozzle. The range of such flamethrowers was small, usually no more than 10-15 meters, but this was sufficient for fighting in trenches or buildings. The ignition system was also makeshift. An ignition device was attached to the end of the nozzle. This could be a torch, a rag soaked in gasoline, or even a car spark plug connected to a battery. The design was extremely unreliable. A leak of combustible mixture or compressed gas could turn the flamethrower operator into a living torch. Any bullet or shrapnel hitting the fuel tank had fatal consequences. Nevertheless, such devices were actively used. There are known examples of the use of homemade flamethrowers by Soviet partisans and participants in the Warsaw Uprising. In a desperate situation, this weapon gave the assault group a chance to suppress the enemy's firing point. Creating such a flamethrower required not only courage, but also serious technical knowledge. It was a weapon of desperate engineers who assembled deadly devices from scrap in underground workshops. The history of homemade flamethrowers is a story of how, in the hell of war, people created their own pocket hell. It is a grim testimony to the sacrifices and risks that had to be made for victory. Now you're definitely going to be shocked. Not all of the soldiers' creations were weapons in the literal sense of the word. Often their ingenuity was directed toward creating defensive structures capable of stopping or slowing down the advance of enemy equipment. One of the most famous and effective of these inventions was the anti-tank hedgehog. This simple but ingenious design was a three-dimensional obstacle welded from three pieces of rolled steel. Most often, I-beams or ordinary rails were used. They were welded or bolted together in the center so that the ends diverge in 6 directions. The principle of operation of the hedgehog was based on its geometry. No matter how it lay on the ground, one of its beams was always directed upward. This made it an insurmountable obstacle for tanks and other armored vehicles. When a tank tried to drive over a hedgehog, the steel beam would hit its undercarriage. If it tried to keep going, the tank could just run into the obstacle and get stuck, losing traction. In this position, it became helpless and an easy target. The main advantage of the hedgehogs was their simplicity of manufacture. They could be mass-produced in any workshop that had welding and rolled metal. In the conditions of total war, when every kilogram of steel counted, this was the ideal solution. Another advantage was their mobility. Unlike concrete roadblocks, hedgehogs were relatively light. They could be transported by truck and quickly installed in tank-prone areas, creating entire defensive lines. They could be used not only in open areas, but also on city streets. Several rows of hedgehogs could completely block a street, turning it into an impassable barricade. This made them an indispensable element of urban defense. In the next chapter, we will move from large-scale barriers to miniature devices capable of changing the course of an entire covert operation. The war was fought not only on the battlefields, but also deep behind enemy lines. Saboteurs and Secret Service agents needed special weapons, compact, inconspicuous, and reliable. The British Special Operations Executive, SOE, became a veritable factory for the production of such devices, and one of the most ingenious was the pencil detonator. Outwardly, this device looked like an ordinary pencil. It could be carried quietly in a pocket without arousing any suspicion. However, inside it concealed a complex chemical mechanism capable of initiating an explosion at a precisely specified time. The detonator's body consisted of a copper tube. Inside it was a glass ampule containing copper sulfate. This ampule was held in place by a thin alloy wire that was susceptible to corrosion by the acid. The principle of operation was based on a simple chemical reaction. To activate the detonator, the saboteur had to squeeze the body, crushing the glass ampule. The acid leaked out and began to slowly corrode the retaining wire. The thickness of the wire determined the delay time. There were detonators with different activation times, from 10 minutes to 24 hours. The color of the casing corresponded to the delay time, which allowed the saboteur to quickly select the right device. When the acid completely corroded the wire, it released the spring-loaded striker. The striker hit the detonator cap, which in turn initiated the explosion of the main explosive charge. This device was a real marvel of miniaturization for its time. It was silent, had no clockwork mechanism, and was virtually impossible to detect. It was a real headache for enemy counterintelligence. Pencil detonators made it possible to carry out complex sabotage operations. An agent could plant explosives, activate the detonator, and calmly leave the site long before the explosion. This significantly increased the saboteur's chances of survival. A mortar is a simple and effective weapon for indirect fire, indispensable in trench warfare and urban combat. It allowed mines to be thrown over walls and into trenches, striking the enemy in hiding. But like any factory-made weapon, mortars were not always available to everyone. Partisan detachments and surrounded garrisons, deprived of supplies, were in dire need of their own artillery. The solution was to create homemade mortars from readily available materials. Most often, large-diameter pipe scraps were used for this purpose. A steel water or gas pipe could serve as the barrel for such a mortar. One end of the pipe was welded shut or plugged with a massive metal plug. A striker, a pointed metal pin, was welded to the bottom of this plug. Any suitable heavy object served as a base plate. It could be a sheet of thick steel, a car brake disc, or even just a large flat stone. The main task of the plate was to absorb the recoil energy and prevent the mortar from digging into the ground. The shells for such mortars were homemade mines. Their bodies were made from scraps of smaller diameter pipes, tin cans, or shell casings. Explosives were placed inside, usually obtained from unexploded shells. A stabilizer made of tin was attached to the tail of the mine to ensure a stable flight. A propellant charge of gunpowder and a primer were placed in the tail. The principle of operation was the same as that of a factory-made mortar. The mine was lowered into the barrel, it was ignited by the primer on the firing pin, the propellant charge was activated and pushed the mine out of the barrel. The accuracy of such devices was very low. The range and direction of the mine's flight depended on many factors: the quality of the gunpowder, the weight of the mine, and the condition of the barrel. However, this was sufficient for conducting harassing fire over large areas. For partisans and resistance fighters in occupied Europe, the main problem was often the lack of firearms. Capturing them from the enemy was difficult and risky, and supplies from the Allies were irregular. In this situation, many underground workshops began to produce their own handmade submachine guns. These homemade automatic weapons, often called semestrally, self-shooting, were the pinnacle of underground weapon craftsmanship. Their design was simplified as much as possible for production with primitive equipment. Any available materials were used: water pipes, sheet steel, car springs. The design of simple and technologically advanced submachine guns, such as the British Stien or the Soviet PPSH, was most often used as a basis. The main principle was a free bolt and firing from an open bolt. This made it possible to avoid complex barrel locking mechanisms. The barrel was the most difficult part to manufacture. It was made from durable steel pipes of a suitable diameter. It was almost impossible to cut rifling into the barrel under artisanal conditions, so most of these homemade guns were smoothbore, which greatly reduced their accuracy. The bolt was machined from a single piece of steel. Its weight was critically important. A bolt that was too light led to an excessively high rate of fire and rapid wear, while one that was too heavy led to malfunctions. The recoil spring was often taken from cars or other equipment. The trigger mechanism was extremely simplified. Often it only allowed for automatic fire, which led to a high consumption of scarce ammunition. Some craftsmen managed to make a fire mode selector switch. These self-made weapons were not just weapons. They were proof that the spirit of resistance could not be broken. Even in the most difficult conditions, people found a way to create weapons to fight for their independence. We have looked at just a few examples of how soldiers' ingenuity turned everyday objects into weapons. Each of these inventions, from a simple club to a sophisticated homemade machine gun, tells its own story. It is a story of survival, despair, and an unyielding will to win. These homemade devices show the other, less glamorous side of war. They demonstrate that behind every great battle were millions of small, personal struggles. In these struggles, soldiers relied not only on orders and standard weapons, but also on their own heads and hands. Inventiveness became as valuable a resource as ammunition or food. The ability to make a grenade out of a sock or a mortar out of a pipe could save the life of an entire unit. These skills were passed down from veterans to recruits, becoming part of the unwritten code of conduct for soldiers. Many of these homemade solutions were extremely dangerous. Using homemade explosives or flamethrowers was playing with death. But when the choice was between risk and certain death, soldiers chose risk. This legacy of trench ingenuity is still alive today. Unfortunately, the principles behind many of these devices are still used in local conflicts around the world. Molotov cocktails and homemade explosive devices remain the weapons of those who do not have access to factory-made arsenals. Studying these items is important not to learn how to make weapons. It is important to understand the true nature of war. It is a reminder that war blurs the line between engineer and soldier, between creation and destruction. These 9 items are only a small part of the vast arsenal created by the hands of nameless soldier geniuses. They are a monument to the human ability to adapt and fight even when all seems lost. This is not a hymn to weapons, but to the spirit that drove them. We conclude our immersion into the world of hidden trench engineering of World War II. These unusual weapon crafts are not just pieces of metal, glass, and wood. They are material evidence of human resilience and ingenuity in the face of mortal danger. They show that war is not only a clash of industrial giants, but also an endless series of personal challenges that required unconventional solutions. Every soldier who made a club or grenade from improvised materials contributed to the overall victory, proving that the most important resource of any army is its people. What do you think about these examples of soldier creativity? Which of these inventions did you find the most ingenious or, conversely, the most desperate? Suggest topics for future videos you would like to see in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel.